I would like to collect a round of questions and then give the say to our panelists again, and then collect the second round afterwards. So there should be a microphone or two around, okay? So please raise your hand, and when you phrase your question, please stand up and say your name first and then phrase the question. That would be nice. So we go on in the middle here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. Christian Resch, Good University. My question relates probably most to you, John Michie, because you have an inside view from the UK. I heard recently people talking a lot from a progressive point of view, very favorably about Brexit, in the sense that every bank which leaves London is a bit less financialization for the economy, and, well, they should be happy for every bank going to Frankfurt. And I would like to know what you think about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, here in the front. Heike.
Yeah, Heike Jöpke, Heike Jöpke is from the HCW Berlin, and I'm one of the organizers of the conference. My question would rather address the first presentation by Jayati Ghosh, and I was wondering, given your conclusions that generally, it seems to be very hard to develop developing countries in the current circumstances, and as you mentioned that they would need active state intervention, which is against WTO rules and other international rules, what would you recommend? Would you say it's so important to develop in these circumstances that they should rather than try to shield from WTO rules and rather than give up being integrated in international trade? Would that be worth it? Do you see this as being, realistic?
Thanks. Mark?
My name is Marc Lavoie. I have a question also for Jayati Ghosh. I was wondering what's your views about experimental economics, which pertains to help finding the proper ways to have development in your country.
Yeah, Eckhart.
Yeah, Eckhart Hein, Berlin School of Economics and Law. I have a question both to Bruno Amable and to Jonathan Michie. I mean, having seen your two presentations, I see some, let's say, contradictions or some problems. So, I mean, Bruno, if I got you right, you see some internal dynamics which make things continuously worse. If I got you wrong, please correct me. So this leads me to the second presentation. Your positive outcome is to go for some sort of New Deal, Green New Deal, whatsoever. So I don't see the bridge. So which are the forces which lead us from here to there? I mean, if Bruno was right, there is the internal dynamics make things rather worse than better. So I don't see where we can go from here to there. So if you could expand a bit or maybe comment on each other, this would maybe enlighten me and maybe some others here.
Yeah, they're in the back.
Thank you. Eric Kempenedict from Stockholm Environment Institute. This is for Jayati Ghosh and Bruno Amable. I was wondering what the U.S. is doing now with current administration aggressively withdrawing from multilateral agreements. The U.S. has been pushing the liberalization agenda, and now it's reversing. Does this open some space for pushing against that agenda at the global level?
Back here in the front, Philip.
Our first speaker suggested that international cooperation would enhance globalization. And what's happened over the last week or so is that the new president of the United States refuses to collaborate. Would that produce a crisis of globalization?
Over there in the middle.
Hello, my name is Arnaud. It was said during one of your talk that... Sorry? Yeah?
Yeah. Go on. Go on.
It was said during one of your talk that liberalization of trade increases welfare, but not necessarily GDP growth. So why is that so?
Excuse me, to whom was that addressed?
Anyone, but it was
Anyone?
more
Okay.
anyone that can shine some light.
And then we have another question in the middle, and then I would close the first round, but there was still one over there. I would take that on board as well, and then I would close the first round and give our speakers the chance to respond.
Hello, thank you for the presentations. My name is Hanat-Dagaspi, and I think my question is more for Professor Michie. You talked about Tony Blair, so that brought some memories. Basically, we had about 30 years of very mild opposition among mainstream political parties. I think Tony Blair is the best example of that. And after the 2008 crisis, the oppositions were very slow to materialize, to actually grab more bite than they had in the past 30 years. And I think that's also a reflection on the right-wing populism and Brexit, etc., this lack of alternatives. How do you see, specifically the case of the UK, how do you see Jeremy Corbyn? And if this is an alternative, this is a new opposition, this is a new Labour, or an old Labour, how do you see that? Thank you.
Yeah, one last question over there. I don't remember who raised his arm. But was there one? No? Okay. So then we close the first round, and I would like to start in reverse order and give the word to Jonathan.
Okay, yeah. The first one about whether Brexit will prove good for Britain because banks will leave the country. I think that the problem with being too hopeful about that for the people of Britain is a huge difference, I think, when change is brought about as a result of positive mobilisation, political change, which is then enacted and followed through, rather than some negative sort of failure. And specifically, while the British economy does need a rebalancing away from the bloated financial sector and more infrastructure and industry in other parts of the country, that's unlikely to, well, it certainly won't happen as a result of banks just moving out of London. So the danger is, and I think probably likelihood is that it would just leave more unemployed people and have no positive benefit, particularly since if the government just remained as committed to as before to sort of free market approach, deregulated approach to financial services. So I doubt that would be very beneficial myself. In terms of how we get from here to there in terms of Green New Deal, well, and it's related to the Corbyn thing, I mean, it's political, basically. I mean, it does need governments to enact relevant policies. I mean, obviously, the last time something like that was done, Bretton Woods, obviously, it was very, very different, and they had the 1930s, very strong feeling that there should be no return to there. So obviously, it was a very different time, but it does need people basically to reflect. I mean, not just electorates, but governments and other institutions to reflect on the fact that the global financial crisis and global recession was very damaging and costly, was completely unnecessary, and yet nothing's really been put in its place to replace the system that caused that. And it's quite likely to happen again in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. So it's a question of political action, really, which relates to the Jeremy Corbyn point, because Jeremy Corbyn's campaigners did pledge those sorts of actions towards what I would characterise as a Green New Deal type of approach to the economy, to be more regulatory to promote environmental issues and sustainability.
Regarding the possible contradiction between the two approaches, I think it's because you talk about the financial sector, and I was talking about all the other institutions. And what took place, of course, during the financial crisis, was that the financial sector was on the brink of total collapse. So I suppose that, and this goes to the question, another question I was asked regarding the space for further liberalisation. Of course, there isn't much space for further liberalisation in the financial sector. And I suppose that in this area, the thing they did was to resist change and to try to preserve as much what they had rather than go in the opposite direction and you know, have a totally reversal of course regarding liberalisation. But regarding the internal dynamics, yes, it's true. I mean, there is a certain logic where certain reforms implemented in some areas are going to weaken the actors who would be willing to oppose further reforms going in the same direction in other areas. And this is, in a way, a cumulative process, which, and the only limits are those you can meet when precisely you've got an event such as the financial crisis of 2008, where obviously something needs to be done to stop the movement that took place before. But, I mean, those events are, of course, quite rare.
Yeah, thank you for these. Let me begin with the last question first. The young man who asked about, I don't think I said liberalization of trade increases welfare, because I don't believe it at all. But I think there was a slide in which I said the arguments of those who argue that global international stability can generate progress. And those people who argue that say that, in fact, stable global regimes enable the expansion of trade. So it's a particular position about whether or not global stability enhances the possibilities for development. And that's one set of positions. There's another set that says, well, no, it's actually instability that enables development more because it breaks up existing divisions of labor and so on. So that's the sense in which I meant it. But related to that, why do I think liberalization of trade doesn't necessarily benefit development, which I do believe it, that it's in many cases anti-development, essentially because of this, because of static and dynamic economies of scale, which make it very difficult for those who either are late starter industrializers or who do not have large sizes of increasing returns industries to actually enter markets that are otherwise taken over. And global value chains actually make that much, much harder because they lock you into particular positions in that value chain. This is kind of related to the argument about state intervention and WTO rules. It's not just the WTO. Now, increasingly, there's a whole range. I mean, it's the range of FTAs, multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral, the BITs, the bilateral investment treaties, etc. There is an international legal architecture that now prevents most of the things that all the developed world did to get developed. So clearly, if you want to develop, you can't do it. I mean, all the examples of countries that managed to develop dramatically are countries that systematically were not constrained by these kinds of rules. Whether it is, the late 20th century examples of East Asia, or it is China in the recent past, have been essentially following not just heterodox policies, but much more controlled. And even the liberalization has been on the basis of a much greater control and command regime that then opened up in particular bits. So yes, I think that developing countries that really do want to develop would have to break away, in a way, from many of those constraints, which does not mean that you rely less on trade. That is another myth. It could well mean that you are directing trade much more, that you are controlling its nature, that you are controlling investment much more, which China does to this day, that you are putting less limits on intellectual property, because in fact no country has industrialized without copying, and it's a bit silly to have to keep reinventing the wheel just because there are intellectual property rights over it and so on. Yes, I think a lot of that institutional architecture is a hindrance and a constraint on development, and to the extent that it dissolves, it's not a bad thing. The notion that a lot of these trade deals are about trade is also a complete myth now. I mean, TTIP, for example, which you were lucky to get out of because of Trump. You be grateful for what we get, right? It was not about trade. I mean, the trade component was not even 4% from what I remember. Yeah, it's all about intellectual property, regulation, and all kinds of issues that would further enhance the control of large corporations. So, and this is also true of many of the other trade deals that are being signed as we speak, the RCEP in Asia, which China is driving. We also have to remember, I think the question about Trump abandoning that, is that a good thing? Yes. As I said, be grateful for what you get. I mean, we're always getting the adverse fallout of activities. Here's a guy doing bad stuff, and then we get a few positives, like the TPP, for example, not becoming such an overarching thing, although the rest of the countries are still trying to do it. But it doesn't mean that others won't try and write rules of the game that suit them. And what's very interesting now is that China has become the great votary of free trade and multilateral agreements. It's not surprising at one level because through history, it's always the rising powers that have favored these. Yeah, I mean, Britain becomes the great votary of free trade in the mid-19th century, and now the declining power is against all these agreements. The rising power is in favor of these agreements. But China, which is the driving force between RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that India is also going to become a signatory to, probably today, I think they're signing it. It's giving very similar rules. It's also protecting investment excessively. It's also protecting intellectual property. It's also, in other words, it's also generating similar kinds of things. So the fact that the US is withdrawing does open some space. I think that's true. Does it open enough space? Not yet. Because I think global capital turns out to be bigger than the US administration, unfortunately. Bigger, stronger, better, whatever, and capitalism still being the only game in town. This brings me to that question about international cooperation and would enhance globalization. Let me put it this way, that the periods when global capitalism, and capitalism has always been global, but the periods when global capitalism has been successful have been those where there has been cooperation between powers, okay? So global capitalism will not be successful if there is no cooperation. On the other hand, will it lead to crisis? I think we're already in a crisis. We're not recognizing it as a crisis. I recently read this rather depressing but very convincing book by Wolfgang Streeck, How Will Capitalism Die? And he's basically saying, look, it's dying or dead. It's just that there's nobody else there to push its body out of the way. Yeah, so we're stuck in this, it's a horribly dystopic book, right? But we're stuck in this scenario where basically capitalism is dead, but there's nothing else around. There's no wonderful socialism on a white charger to come and save us. And therefore, it's like the Dark Ages. You are stuck in an individual dystopia and there's no organized global system, and all kinds of horrible things emerge instead. If we don't want to have that dystopic view, then the answer must be that you need an international cooperation that allows flexibility. In fact, again, the Havana Charter gives you a possibility for much more global trade with national policies to promote employment. So it's not, again, trade versus something else. It is recognizing that trade has to be contained and regulated, investment has to be contained and regulated for national development strategies, which I think are just as valid for the developed world, because they're also about employment and all of these issues that are so important today. So I would say that that the current global order is certainly dysfunctional. Whether it's dead or not is a different, we're all stuck in it, right? But it's certainly not delivering in terms of any of the things it's supposed to deliver. Changing it will therefore require, if not, big revolutionary changes, certainly changes that chip away at those elements that disable national governments from responding to their citizenry. I think that's the critical thing. Finally, on experimental economics. Okay, many different kinds of it. If it's the RCT version, the randomized control trial stuff, to be frank, I think it sucks. Okay, most of the stuff that we get, and we are the recipients, okay? Always developing countries are the ones we come and get studied. And then, we have wonderful, amazing findings like girls go to schools where there are loos for girls. And, similar kinds of very important and otherwise unknown kinds of facts. I find that I think it is a very depressing extension of the idea of that, very, very micro so-called innovations in approach can be taken and applied to all of the process of development, which, as we know, is a macro and historical evolutionary process. But instead, you can take these little findings that you go into in some place in Kenya, and then you go back to Bangalore and say, okay, they're all the same, these developing countries. Women there liked it better when they got the money because they could do something. So the women in Bangalore will like it too. So you look for these little micro fixes that you can then go and apply across developing countries as these ways to get rid of poverty or ways to develop. And I think it's not just a completely wrong notion of what the process of development is, but it's deeply neocolonial. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for this first round. We have at least 7 minutes left for a second round, so I would like to collect about 5 questions. Okay, so then, we start down here.
And then there's a young man
and then
back there. Yeah.
Over there.
Okay, Jens Christensen, formerly from Mount Holyoke College in the US. A question related to, you just talked about China as sort of the new driving force of the global economy. A very simple question in terms of the map that you had. There was only one arrow to Africa, and my own perception is that the Chinese are extremely active in different African countries, building up, their own raw material sources and investment all over the place.
Yeah.
Then over there in the back, there was a second question, and then here in the front again.
Hello, my name is Mateus. And my question is to Ghosh. You were talking earlier about India and China, and now about the dysfunctional global order. So I would like to know, how do you see the BRICS institutions in this dysfunctional global order, and especially the China's role inside the BRICS institutions? Thank you.
Then here in the front.
Yeah, my name is Jasper Zimmerman. I'm a journalist. I have a question about the Green New Deal. So this is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, and I love the idea too. Do you have any knowledge of specific proposals on the table, also in the context of India, for large-scale visionary Green New Deal projects that say we should spend this much money on these categories of things? Are there any specific proposals out there?
Maybe that question goes out to
ideally also with
all three.
Assessments of what their macroeconomic effects would be, a little bit of analysis behind it.
So we have some time to collect 2 more questions.
But nobody wants to ask any.
Don't be shy. Over there. Oh.
I'd like to know why nobody said that the fundamental beneficiary of globalization was China. The Americans thought it would be them. The rich countries thought it would be them. I think that this should be commented.
Over there we have a last question, and then I would like to close that round as well.
Hello, Antoine Monsoin from Paris 13. A question to Bruno Amable. You said the mainstream view on globalization is that it will necessarily, or it will, like LMEs will go more liberal and coordinated market economies will go more coordinated to reinforce their competitive position. And you said I don't agree with that, and I think they will both be forced to go more liberal, including the coordinated, if I understood well. But you didn't explain why. And so for you, globalization and pressure on liberalization is necessarily the same, or there are different ways to still be globalized? And also, by the way, what do you think about deglobalization? Because we never talk about that, but there's no point in talking so much about globalization as something bad and never trying to find another way.
Thank you very much. So let's, I would say, start with Bruno this time.
No, I'm not equating strictly globalization with an all-out pressure for liberalization everywhere in the same conditions. My point is that globalization is a possibility opened by some forces, some domestic forces, for precisely favoring liberalization. But it doesn't mean that it is going to take place at the same pace in every area, in every country at the same time. So the point is that, in some countries, which Hull and Soskis would consider coordinated market economies, liberalization has been limited to either some areas or some part of the population, and in fact it is true that according to their own standards, those countries are less coordinated than they used to. And regarding the evolution of already very liberalized economies, I think that the question is a bit different anyway. Globalization is not per se necessarily equal to liberalization, or at least it's not equal to liberalization in the same conditions everywhere, and not necessarily at the same time. And regarding deglobalization, I think, it's an interesting part. The way I understand it is precisely to rebalance the economic structure, to bring back some productive activities back to the countries which relocated these activities beforehand. And it's true that the movement of globalization, which was relocation and removing the productive part of the productive activity from the country in order to relocate them somewhere else, it was certainly a thing which was instrumental in making what used to be called a producer's pact in some countries, to make this pact impossible, or at least more difficult to implement. So the question would be whether relocation, meaning deglobalization, would bring back this possibility of having a producer's pact made possible and go back to the equivalent of the Fordist compromise, which was, as I mentioned, an alliance between labour and a fraction of capital, instead of an alliance between capital and a fraction of labour, which is more characteristic of the neoliberal age.
Thank you. Jayati?
Do you want Jonathan first? Or?
As you wish.
Yeah, okay. Well, I had one which is examples of Green New Deal actually being pursued or implemented. And no, as far as I know, not at a global level. I think that's the problem. We're still stuck in the free market form of globalization. And obviously in individual countries there have been things being done, most obviously with renewable energy. Even in Britain there were schemes to promote renewables and so on. I guess that's the most serious sector. But no, nothing much as far as I can see.
Thank you. Lots of questions about China, and I agree, Bresser. Yes, China was the beneficiary of globalization precisely because it wasn't neoliberal. And it was able to benefit because it was able to do state-directed policies, whether it is control over credit, or it was allocations of investment, or it was a whole range of things that enabled it to pursue a very effective mercantilist strategy. Of course, the other beneficiary of globalization is the country we're sitting in right now, which was, I should say, more a beneficiary of the Eurozone than globalization per se, but the big beneficiary of European integration in that sense, in terms of being able to run significant current account surpluses, to the extent that Germany is trying to now create the rest of Europe in its own image to run current account surpluses. It's a bit like Wolfgang Streeck said about capitalism. It's a bit too successful for its own good. It's creating the conditions for failure because it is destroying the oppositions which would have put in constraints that allow it to grow in a more stable way. So I take your point. I think similarly, the Chinese thing, the question Jens on China and Africa, absolutely true. I didn't mention it because it's not part of OBOR. It's not in the, it's not part of the One Belt, One Road link because it doesn't fall in the, and that's old Silk Route kind of idea. But absolutely, Chinese investments and aid combination in Africa have been enormous. The Chinese Development Bank and the Chinese Exim Bank alone, their budget last year in Africa was $180 billion. G7, by contrast, gave, I think, $6 billion. A lot of it was in terms of aid that was actually, previous loans that were written off and so on. So yes, China's presence in real terms, in financial terms, in a whole range of ways, has been incredibly huge in Africa, and of course has created different kinds of responses in Africa as well. The dominant view, however, in Africa, unlike the dominant view in Europe where everybody says, oh, China is exploiting them and taking their resources and doing all this as if the Europeans didn't, is the dominant view in Africa is that, well, it's always better to have competing imperialisms. You can actually get better terms when you do that. And I think that there is something in that. On the BRICS question, BRICS is a really funny idea. Imagine a grouping of countries that comes together because an investment banker writes an article saying that the four of you are similar. But that is the history of BRICS. Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs writes an article saying Brazil, Russia, India, China, they're all going to be the 21st century leaders because of their demographics. And then everyone starts saying, oh, break, break, break. It wasn't yet the S. And then these countries start looking at each other and say, hey, yeah, that's true. And we're also the regional leaders. And, so let's get together. And they start meeting. It's a really weird grouping that you think about it. China brings in South Africa because you then get the African link. So you have the three regional kinds of sub-imperialists or whatever getting together. But it didn't, and interestingly, because it got together, then you actually had a lot of things. You had the New Development Bank, you have barter trade going on big time, you have various other currency swap arrangements and so on and so forth. So things started moving for a while with BRICS. A lot of that is collapsing today, partly because the global crisis meant that Brazil and Russia certainly were badly affected as commodity traders. China is changing its interests and much more looking both regionally and in other ways to extend its influence. And BRICS is not, BRICS at least has the semblance of, everybody equal at the table. And it doesn't really suit the current requirements of the Chinese regime. So I don't think BRICS per se is going to be all that significant. China, of course, will continue to be very, very significant in many different ways. And just to end on that, on the Green New Deal, no, it's true, there is no global Green New Deal, although there should and there could be. But if you look at what has happened globally, it's a very interesting thing. The last 2 years have been the first time ever that global carbon emissions have fallen while global GDP has risen. That break did never occur before. And it occurred despite Trump, and it occurred fundamentally because of China, dramatic increase in investment in renewables over the past decade, which was the subject of trade disputes with the US and Europe, and is currently also the EU has put yet another trade dispute in the WTO against China because they are subsidizing solar energy. How dare they? However, because China invested so dramatically in renewables, it has brought down global prices of renewables to the point where they are competitive at $60 per barrel of oil. Oil currently at $70 per barrel. You now have competitive renewables industry. US industry is responding because they also want to be in on the game. Europeans are investing in renewables independent of state policy because it's now profitable to do so. And therefore, in fact, there's a huge change that has been brought about simply by that significant public sector-driven investment by China in renewables, which has changed the whole global picture for renewables. It's one of the, I'm not saying that this is a global phenomenon, but let me put it this way. It's an international phenomenon resulting from the activities of one important national player. That's one of the many ways in which China has already reshaped different kinds of global patterns. Whether it will be enough to reshape capitalism, I don't think. because unfortunately it is still relying fundamentally on the neoliberal model despite being deeply state-driven. But maybe things will change. Thank you.
Thank you very much.